Global.
The Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 73.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you today. And on today's episode, we have on Ellen Anderson, who is the Executive Director of the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab. She also served in the state Senate in Minnesota from 1993 through 2011 and was reelected 5 times, which is quite an accomplishment in itself. Well, she's done all kinds of stuff, and today we're going to talk about a report that she recently issued, was the main author on, and a couple other things. And we're going to link to all of this stuff in the show notes, which you can find at globalenergymedia.com. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Ellen Anderson. Ellen, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, and how are you?
Well, I am good. So let's get into it. You have worked as a senator in Minnesota. What got you involved in public service and energy? And just kind of give us a short snippet of your background here.
Sure. Well, I was elected to the state Senate in the early 90s and served for 18 years and really was interested in public service and trying to make my community a better place to live, and that's what motivated me to run and serve. And I worked on many different kinds of issues during my years in office, but I became especially fascinated by energy issues and ended up authoring lots of energy legislation and passed our state's renewable energy portfolio standard, which requires at least 25% renewable electricity. And so that experience taught me a lot about energy, and it's been just such a fascinating time to be learning about what's going on in our energy system because it's transforming so quickly. And so that led me to move on as chair of our Public Utilities Commission, and then I worked as an energy advisor to Governor Mark Dayton here in Minnesota, and now have the pleasure of working at the University of Minnesota, working on energy issues still. And that's really what, gets me up in the morning to figure out how we can make our energy system better and help us transition to that energy system of the future that I think there's a pretty broad consensus that we need an energy system that is lower carbon, that is more flexible, that is able to integrate large amounts of growing renewable energy, and that takes advantage of our amazing technology revolution and information technology, and that really serves the needs of customers and the public.
Okay, great. So just a quick follow-up on your time in the Senate there. What are your thoughts on the role of the state versus the role of the federal government as it pertains to energy policy?
That's a great question. And I think under the current administration in Washington, the role of state, regional, and local governments is more important than it's ever been before in terms of setting energy policy and trying to lead us towards a future energy system. Because the federal government is backing out of the Paris Agreement and reducing its involvement in setting energy policy. So I think, it's a more important time than ever. And you'll find that around the United States, there are many, many states and cities that are jumping into energy planning and energy policy, and many corporations. And so it's been a really interesting time in the United States that it feels as if all these other sectors are kind of stepping into that vacuum of policy direction.
One of the things on this show is we like to have guests on that have a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different viewpoints. And so, since the Paris Climate Agreement with the U.S. backing out has come out, we've had some folks come on and talk about it. But the thing that I think I've said here and that you point to is that it's been interesting to watch because you see people say, okay, we pulled out and it's bad for America, and we can debate on whether that's a good thing or not. But what I have seen is it's interesting. As someone who likes the free market, I've seen in smaller government generally, I've seen the local governments come up and say, okay, well, you know what, we're still going to do this. And I've seen corporations come out and say, we're going to do this too. And so it seems that the model of the Paris Agreement was looking to implement, at least for what the U.S. standards were going to be, will still be rolled out on some level. And then those ideas will get to go out to the marketplace and compete. And I think we'll be able to look back 5-10 years from now and go, okay, you know what? Maybe those restrictions weren't as bad as some people thought they were, or maybe these kind of restrictions can be looked at as a wider spectrum across the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. It seems to me that the way the market is driving the price of renewable energy down so low that it's kind of undercutting conventional energy sources, and the cost of energy storage is coming down, and there's just so much cheap natural gas as well that's really putting pressure on other conventional fossil fuels. These big global market forces are pushing our energy system forward, whether or not there is federal policy, whether or not there are policies that, like the Clean Power Plan, in effect. I think you're going to continue to see these trends moving in that same direction. And so I think the Paris Agreement was incredibly important because it said countries all said, yeah, we're all in this together and we're going to try our best to take responsibility and make sure that everybody plays a role. So it's not just all the burden isn't on one country and all the benefit isn't just on one country. So that's good, but I think the actual implementation of all of these ideas always happen at a more local level. That's where the energy projects are done, and that's where you have to account for local factors and local conditions. And so I think implementation, rightly, will tend to happen at a more local level, whether it's at a company or a city or a state level. And so I think you're right. It'll be very interesting to see, maybe 4 or 5 years from now, how much we have continued to move forward to maybe achieve some of those aspirations that are not really required anymore.
Absolutely. And so I want to transition now into a report or an analysis that you were the main author for called Modernizing Minnesota's Grid, an economic analysis of energy storage opportunities, which just was released here early July 11th of this year. What made you want to write this, and what are some of the key findings in this report?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to talk about it. And I'll say that it really started with working with stakeholders. And so a lot of what we do here at the Energy Transition Lab here at the University of Minnesota is work with a broad array of people in the energy sectors, from the utilities to the renewable energy companies to the government officials to corporations to communities and our regional grid operators, MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, also known as MISO, et cetera. And so we bring these people, many of them, to the table along with academic and other research experts, and really try to explore cutting-edge issues in energy. And so that's kind of how we started this process of getting to this report. We convened a couple of high-level workshops of leading energy experts and stakeholders from around our state and a few national experts, and really dug into the topic of energy storage to say, hey, what are the opportunities here in Minnesota? Is the market ready here in our state and in our region? And if so, what do those opportunities look like? What are the barriers? And what else do we need to know to understand how energy storage might, add benefits or cost to our energy system? So we started with kind of an exploration, and our stakeholders learned a lot. We all learned together and learned from a number of experts and presented a lot of information, and then brainstormed about, what are some of the most intriguing possibilities for energy storage in a place like ours. And I'll give you, just by way of background for that, in Minnesota in particular, because we do have these strong renewable energy policies in place, we are moving ahead. We're at about 23% renewable electricity in our state's grid and growing, and most of that is wind, and now solar is booming quickly too. Even though we're a northern state, we have pretty good solar resource. And our state actually has no fossil fuel reserve, so we have to import all the fossil fuels that we use. And so we're in a unique position in the Midwest where we've been traditionally coal dependent, like most of the Midwest has been, but we're quickly evolving into a much more renewable energy driven system. And so that's one of the reasons why the exploration of energy storage seemed really important. So some of the other factors that our stakeholders identified are the issue of peak demand. And so, every energy system experiences peak demand, and there's times, mostly on hot summer days, where everybody's running their air conditioner at the same time, and the grid is really stressed, and it's, the highest amount of energy being used at any point in the year. And what we do conventionally in the United States is build mostly natural gas peaking plants to serve that need. And in fact, in Minnesota, we've identified something like 1,800 megawatts of new natural gas peaking capacity that is planned for our state over the next decade or so. And so we looked at that and said, could energy storage meet that need for shaving off peak demand as an alternative to building new plants that are expensive to build and to operate and really only run for a few hours of the year. So there are a lot of underutilized capacity with a lot of sunk costs. So we wanted to investigate that. And another area that our group decided was really important was to look at the whole energy system, because in the Midwest, we're part of this MISO grid. And, most of our utilities, even though they self-generate, they sell at the wholesale level into the MISO grid. And so we're very integrally connected into the broader regional grid of the 15 states and Manitoba that our grid operator covers. So with that, we, between our two stakeholder workshops, we procured the services of two expert consultant companies, Strategen Consulting and Vibrant Clean Energy, led by Dr. Chris Clack, and we had Ed Burgess from Strategen Consulting, who did some analysis and modeling to answer some of those questions that the stakeholders posed to them. And so this report is really a compilation of all the discussion and information we shared and learned, and then the modeling results from our two experts. And then at the very end of the process, the last thing we did was have our stakeholders, in light of everything that they learned and the results from this modeling, what are the next steps that we should be talking about in our state? And so we have a lot of information in this, and I could go through some of the highlights of some of the modeling analysis.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the modeling, because that's exactly where I wanted to go. One of the things I think that kind of gets lost sometimes in these discussions is that a lot of these, no matter where you come in on energy, it's a lot of modeling based on how you're going to project what's going to happen. What were some of the difficulties that you guys faced when you were looking to do your modeling? Because it seems that depending on how big the model is and how complex it is, obviously some of the numbers are just off just a little bit. Yeah, your projections can be off. So how did you try to balance your model to make sure that you had the most accurate model possible?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Your assumptions are really determine what goes in, what comes out. I think the way we tackled that was first to use really reputable sources of information and to cross-check them across several different sources. So, for example, in our use case analysis, we looked at using solar and storage or energy storage standalone as an alternative to gas peaking plant, and we had to evaluate, what are the market costs of all these different technologies and how are those prices changing, and what's the input cost of natural gas, and what's the cost of battery storage, and what will it look like 5 years from now. And so some of that is forecasting, some of it is information available right now from a variety of sources. So we just look to some of the most respected sources of information around the country, like national labs that are experts on different kinds of energy issues and are trusted sources of information.
Absolutely. Well, the other thing that caught my eye was energy storage, and you've used that term a couple times here. Energy storage, if you talk to people, it seems like there's kind of a wide variety of opinions on energy storage and the best way to do it, how practical it is for different types of resources. What was the results of your findings in this study?
Yeah, so we focused in our modeling assumptions, only on lithium-ion battery storage, which is kind of the fastest growing sector of energy storage. But it does need to be said, there's all different kinds of storage, and some of them have been around for a very long time. But there is a big boom on lithium-ion batteries. So that's what we looked at, and those prices are coming down rapidly. And I guess by way of sort of preview, a lot of people in Minnesota were kind of skeptical, like, are we really ready for battery storage, or is it really just wildly expensive and not going to be usable? But what we found in our use case analysis was that under an optimal set of energy resource mixes and different kinds of operational practices, energy storage was found to be part of the lowest cost path forward for resource investments, and that in particular, we found that if you include environmental benefits, that solar and storage combined is actually cost effective as an alternative to new gas peaking plants, and as well as significant reductions in emissions. And we did find that if you installed battery storage now as an alternative to a gas peaking plant, it would cost more to do the storage. But with the addition of solar, it became cheaper, in part because of the investment tax credit and in part because of the convergence of solar energy production that often overlaps in at least part of the peak hours of the day. And so people were quite surprised to find that looked to be cost effective in Minnesota right now to build solar plus storage as an alternative. And then we did the MESA system modeling. That was very interesting. It took a much longer view and not just as granular as projects to say, what would it look like in the MISO grid over, the next years up until 2045, the next few decades, if you either had energy storage on a grid scale or if you didn't have it. And the comparison was very, very interesting and showed that if you added more storage, that would enable more low-cost renewable energy, and it would reduce the need for transmission investment. And so it found that it would actually be cost-effective as well over time, that it could be economical over a period of decades in the sense that it would reduce the levelized cost of electricity to include storage over not including it. We also found that adding storage would reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the MISO grid at a sooner time frame and at a lower cost than not having storage. And we found that storage would begin to compete with gas combustion turbines that are used for peaking in MISO. And we also found that if energy storage was not included in the MISO grid, you would tend to have reliance on one fuel source for the vast majority of your electricity production. So that storage really enabled a diversification of new and variable and dispersed kinds of energy resources. So a lot of really interesting results.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there, and we're going to link to this report in the show notes so the listeners can go and dissect it themselves. It's a lengthy report, but there's a lot of good information in it. One thing that you touched on there, I want to circle back around to, is the tax credits for solar. And so, I know that some people, there's kind of a mixed bag of opinion on should we be giving tax credits for renewables or not. Some people say, well, we want the market to produce the best, most cost-effective way to do energy. Is your position that the tax credits are good, or should they maybe be rolled back?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say that the tax credits have been valuable in helping to push forward wind and energy and solar energy to get them from their kind of early stage development into their maturity. And so I think the wind energy industry in particular has started to get to this maturity place in a lot of markets. And solar will follow soon. So I think it's appropriate to have them as you're beginning to build out the technology and getting up to economies of scale and going through sort of that market disruption that causes a lot of churning and new companies, and then over time to phase out those tax incentives because they're really not necessary anymore. So I think that's kind of a unique attribute of renewable energy that makes it different from some fossil fuel kinds of energy, that it actually can get to a maturity point where it doesn't need any kind of subsidies anymore, whereas some kinds of energy, like nuclear, for example, even though nuclear energy continues to kind of innovate in its technology, it doesn't get any cheaper. It just gets more expensive, it seems like, over time. So it's very interesting. And so I think you really have to compare all the different funding streams that are used in the federal government to support all different kinds of energy if you're going to make a fair comparison.
Modernizing Minnesota's Grid, an economic analysis of energy storage opportunities, is the report that we're talking about. We will link to it in the show notes. You touched on nuclear. That's exactly where I was going next. Did this, because you haven't mentioned it before until this last comment, how much of that was a part of this study, or was it kind of outside the scope of the study?
It wasn't really part of our study. It is a part of Minnesota's energy mix. We have something like 17% of our electricity coming from two nuclear plants in our state. And certainly in the MISO grid, there's quite a bit of nuclear energy. And so it plays a very significant role in our region. And there's been some interesting policy developments which I'm not an expert on, but in states like Illinois, where they're trying to figure out how to keep the nuclear plants operating in a context with very low wholesale prices driven down by really cheap wind, which tends to blow a lot at night and really just drive wholesale prices down. So there's been a lot of discussion about that, but that broader context was not necessarily part of this particular conversation. It wasn't a variable that we measured.
Gotcha. Okay, one final thing before we get out of here. I want to ask about Minnesota's 2025 Energy Action Plan. What can you tell us about that initiative?
So that was an initiative that was led by the state of Minnesota and the Minnesota legislature that said, let's go forth and study what are, emerging, growing, high potential technologies for Minnesota in terms of our energy transition and our energy future. And a lot of experts who are involved in different kinds of energy technologies, such as energy storage or lesser used kinds of things like electric vehicles or combined heat and power, to really dig into those topics and think about, do they play a role in Minnesota in the future? And if so, why would they be beneficial or not so much? And what would it take, what kind of a roadmap would it take to be able to take advantage of some of these technologies that do seem to be high potential for improving our energy system? So it's a nice roadmap, very technology focused, and was kind of like the way I described our process. It was definitely driven by a lot of stakeholder input.
Okay, great. And we're going to link to both of these reports, and also we're going to link to some of your legislation that you passed when you were in the Minnesota Senate, and the listeners can check all that out in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com. Where else can folks find you if they want to find out more about what you have going on right now?
Yeah, wonderful. You can go to our website, www.energytransition.umn.edu. That's UMN as in University of Minnesota. And our website has information about some of our upcoming events, and some of our previous reports that we've done are on there as well.
Okay, great. And we will link to that all in the show notes for the listeners. Ellen, thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Thanks again to Ellen for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion. And question of the day, should the government subsidize renewable energy? That's something we've talked about before on the show, and would love to know your thoughts. Ryan at globalenergymedia.com. Let me know your answer, and we will read it on the air. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.